Jeffrey, thank you very much for that canter through all the areas that a constitution to tackle. No short list. I think we all agree that there is a desire for the new Libyan constitution to be much more than just a showcase constitution. So with that, I will turn over to our panel for their initial thoughts on the content of any future Libyan constitution. And how to make sure not just that that content is appropriate, but that it is also effective further down the line. Elham, I wonder if you'd like to kick off with your initial thoughts to the presentation.
Thank you. It's always dangerous to start with a lawyer and ask them to be brief and have quick reactions, but I'll do my best. I think I could speak for hours on this topic, but I'm very aware that not everyone finds the law as interesting as I do. I want to open with one point and then focus on three elements of a constitution. The first part is the legitimacy of it as a document, and I think that's where the concept of ownership comes from. At the moment in Libya, all legitimacy comes from the revolution, of the 17th of February revolution. So if you were part of the revolution, you are good. If you weren't, you are bad. If you did something for the revolution, then you've got some kind of claim on a government. And I think it's natural, and when everyone was emotional for the revolution, but I think it's now come the time that for us to avoid losing the importance of the rule of law, to move towards actually drawing our legitimacy from law. And to me, that's where the constitution really comes from. It's giving us what we go back to protect ourselves from our governments and that's where I come to this idea of ownership. And my first concern, which isn't in the actual body or the document that is a constitution, but it's in the proposed timeline for the Libyan constitution. It seems to be a fast-forward process where we are going to have our legislative, the constitutive body that's going to draft it elected in 6 or 7 months, and then the initial draft is due 2 months later. And I'm sure from your experience, 2 months is not enough time to produce a draft of a constitution. But I think there is this hunger for law in Libya, and for stability, and for a rule of law, and to have rights enshrined, that actually my biggest fear is we end up creating a shaky ground that we then have to spend a lot of time amending. And so my first comment, I suppose, is to encourage all of us as Libyans to exhale and just take on board the fact that it took many months and years in the cases of a lot of constitutions that we now look to for inspiration. The Kenyan one, the Namibian one, the South African one most certainly were drafted in a very long period with a lot of input. So that's the first point. In terms of specifics, I think there are 3 areas which are of particular emphasis for me. The first is the point of separation of power. I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding that is totally understandable, if that's the right way of putting it, in the sense in Libya we've not really had in the last 40 years a separation of power. And so even now, with this new concept that I was alluding to before, of having this legitimacy coming from the revolution, that if a person from the revolution comes out and suggests a new law or speaks about a new law, no one thinks about whether they're actually the right person to be doing this. So you get Mr. Mustafa Abdel Jalil, who's the head of the executive, effectively, as the president in the NTC, coming out and saying what the laws will be in the new Libya, or in fact declaring, in some cases, what a law is. Or, as we heard yesterday or the day before, suggesting who the main accused in the assassination of Abdel Fattah Yunus are. And as you know, that's not really the role for the executive. And I think it comes from a tradition where we don't hold people accountable when they cross across their powers. And so I definitely need for that to be enshrined. And within that is for me the single most important part of a constitution, because I think it's what safeguards the constitution, and that's the independence of the judiciary. If you don't have judges that will hold the constitution up and wave it in front of politicians and stop them from doing what they're doing, no matter what else you have, you'll end up having the showcase constitution that we were talking about in Russia. And so I think there are different ways to look at that, about how we approach the judiciary. There are key questions that need to be answered, and I appreciate that I'm going to be asking more questions than I'm answering in this part, and forgive me for that. But who's appointed, how they're appointed, how much they're remunerated, who decides the remuneration. All these things impact on whether you then ultimately get a fair judgment from a judge. Quotas. Do we want to have the judge, a Supreme Court have a certain number of women, have a certain number of people from a particular social background or ethnic background to ensure that the judgments are fair? I think we always talk about Kenya as an example of a very good constitution, but actually, they're now starting a vetting process where they're vetting every single one of the judges in Kenya to make sure that they're doing what they're meant to do under the constitution. How do we vet our judges? Is it self-vetting? Is it the judges vetting themselves? Do we bring an external party? It's all these questions that, for us to be able to get to the point of having a judiciary system that is fair and secures the other rights. When we talk about vetting, is there a complaints procedure if you feel like you haven't been done? Is there judicial review? I think one of the most interesting provisions in recent constitutions is in Namibia, where the Attorney General in Namibia is obligated to start cases in the Constitutional Court if something seems unconstitutional. He doesn't have to wait for a case to be brought forward. The Supreme Court serves as a court of first instance. So for me, that's a fundamental process. Amendments, which Sir Geoffrey just mentioned, we don't want those too easy because, how do you secure that the next government is not going to put through a whole bunch of amendments? In my mind, I guess, the simplest way I look at this, when you're looking at a constitution, drafting a constitution, we should be drafting for the worst in our society, not the best. In the sense that a good government and an ethical government, etc., of course they're going to be interpreting the constitution to enshrine rights. Of course they're going to be giving people their liberties. But actually what we're drafting for is to stop a bad government taking advantage of it. Which brings me to my second big point, and that's the role of Sharia in the constitution. And that's where this example of drafting for the people that might abuse as opposed to the people that will implement is key. Because one of the basic examples is that you can have a very strong constitution that guarantees the right of women to vote. If you then have a overarching statement that says it's subject to Sharia, then in theory, the woman can't go to vote without the permission of her husband. And so all of a sudden you lose the right to vote. And so those are the words that are a concern. And so I've got 1 minute left, so I'll skip my third point, which is really good. It's the best one, but you'll have to miss it. To just raise a few alarm bells. One is all this drafting that is quite lazy drafting, but is phenomenally dangerous drafting, which is putting things in a beautiful provision, comma, subject to Sharia, or comma, subject to implementation, or comma, subject to the law. Because actually a lot of what Gaddafi did was lawful under Libyan law. The second one is this importance to protect minorities, and in that, unfortunately, I mean the majority, that is women as well. And the third point is this important need to have ownership and a consultation process which takes you down to the grassroots in Libya to get their opinion, so that when the constitution is ever questioned, the whole country rises up and says, this is mine. And it's not an elitist document. I can tell you all my other wonderful ideas later. That's all.